Hey, welcome back, If this is your first time here, welcome to Utter Lunacy, which is a YouTube channel and podcast where I usually talk about African movies and TV shows. I examine the stories they have to tell about race, class, gender, sexuality. Just, what are they telling us? What themes keep coming up? And yeah, that's pretty much what the channel has done for the longest time. Lately, I have been talking about examining rather how we talk about abuse through TV shows. So through TV shows and interviews, and today I'll be taking a bit of a detour from that. It's related because it's abuse, and this is where I should issue a content warning. Um, if you're not in the right headspace to talk about children being harmed and specifically being murdered by parents and parental figures, this is not the episode for you. So this is the time to tune out. This is the time to switch to the next thing. It's a time to continue doom scrolling. But if you want to stay, if you are able to stay, today we'll be talking about Filicide, which is the murder of children by their parents, or in some cases, they also add in parental figures. Alright, so I'll talk about why I got into this research at this moment, and just what I found out after my deep dive. Introduction. Sara Sharif was a 10-year-old Pakistani British child who was brutally murdered by her father and stepmother. Let me quote BBC here. Quote, Sara was hooded, burned and beaten during a campaign of torture that lasted 2 years before her body was found at the family home in 2023. End quote. Sara had more than 70 new external injuries, including 11 fractures to her spine and signs of traumatic brain injury. She also had 6 possible bite marks, an iron burn, and scalding from hot water. The presiding judge said, quote, the degree of cruelty involved is almost inconceivable, end quote. I found out about Sara Sharif in February of 2025 when people online were discussing the conviction of her father and stepmother. That same month, I found out about Monica Wandani Ndongo, a 35-year-old Kenyan woman who killed her 3 unnamed children and then killed herself. In April, the same year 2025, a police officer in Homa Bay, Kenya, poisoned his 2 children and the son of his brother-in-law and then killed himself. These incidents happening back to back in such a short space of time got me thinking. I remember making assumptions, jumping to all these conclusions about their motivations and the factors at play. The Sara Sharif one was easy. Abusive man kills child, tale as old as time. The 35-year-old woman killing her children, that was either extreme financial pressure or some kind of psychosis. But my money was on financial suffering and wanting to free her children from it. The police officer who killed his wife, open and shut case. Police are textbook abusers, and he very likely did it in retaliation to punish his wife for something. Those were my initial guesses, my assumptions, immediately after hearing the news. So what really happened according to the newspaper reports? Sara Sharif's father was indeed an abusive parent who accidentally killed his child through his abuse. The word accidental here is used because it was not his intention to kill her, just torture her. The 35-year-old woman who killed her children, I was relatively off the mark with that one. She killed her children by hanging. I wasn't expecting that. It's so violent, which isn't usually the case with women. It just hadn't occurred to me that she could have done it like that. I was right about the financial struggles. She lived in semi-permanent structures in an informal settlement in Kenya. That's where the really poor live. Finally, she and her husband had persistent marital issues, according to their neighbors. The police officer had marital troubles with his wife, who had left him and taken the children with her to her matrimonial home. He went, took the children to his house, and killed them. I was right about him. He just wanted to punish his wife, hurt her for daring to leave him. One thing to note is in Kenya, people will say marital trouble and marital disputes when what we're really talking about is an abusive relationship. Keep that in mind. The research shows that behavior is consistent in all the cases. Abusive fathers and husbands are more likely to kill their children. Research also shows women in abusive relationships are more likely to kill their children than women who are not. We'll see all that shortly. The point of the above exercise was to show my biases and my assumptions going into the research. The purpose of this research was to help me gain an accurate, in-depth understanding of filicide, which is the murder of children by their parents. Why do parents kill their children? Are there differences between the motivations of men and women? Are there differences in methods? How prevalent is this kind of crime? How can we prevent and limit its occurrence? Lots of questions. Come with me as we delve into some peer-reviewed research that will tell us not only why it happens, but what we can do to minimize occurrences. One thing that changed for me in the course of the research was it stopped being theoretical and intellectual and became about the actual children who were murdered. Some as brutally as was the case for Sara Sharif and for the 3 children who were hanged by their mother. This will be a difficult one. There are case studies from all over the world that will break your heart. So brace yourself for that. Let's jump in. Infanticide, Filicide, and Neonaticide. Filicide, the murder of children by their parents, is relatively rare, but it's not a new practice. It has a long and persistent history and was widely practiced as a way of controlling population sizes. The children most at risk were female children, as well as those who were handicapped or illegitimate. The Greek exposed, that means left to the elements, or abandoned infants who were deformed or weak or just unwanted. One common method used by women was rubbing opium on the nipples before breastfeeding. Fun fact that's not so fun. Under Roman law, the father had full authority over his children and he decided whether they lived or died. In Africa, certain communities believed children to be one of the groups likely to be linked to mischievous or evil spirits. The children most at risk were those who had a disability or disfigurement, as well as those who had aberrant behaviors or chronic illnesses. Witchcraft-related violence and filicide against children with albinism exists in sub-Saharan Africa, such as in Tanzania. In Igbo culture in Nigeria, there was the killing of twin babies. In Uganda, there are numerous cases of kidnappings and killings because children's body parts are a source of witchcraft magic. Our society is full of stories featuring filicidal parents. In the Bible, Abraham almost sacrifices his son Isaac to prove his faith to God. In Greek mythology, Kronos devours his children to make sure they will not dethrone him. Hansel and Gretel's parents abandon them because they can no longer afford to feed them. Infanticide comes from the Latin word infans, meaning child, and I'm going to say cadere, meaning kill. It refers to the killing of a child without specifying the relationship between the murderer and the victim. In research and in this paper, infanticide refers to the killing of a child within the first year of their life. Neonaticide refers to the killing of a child within the first 24 hours of its life or on the day they're born. Filicide, from the Latin word filius, in the sense of filiation or relation, refers to the killing of a son or daughter. Filicide refers to the killing of a child who is more than 1 year old by their parent or by parental figures such as guardians and step-parents. Infanticide, filicide, and neonaticide are sometimes used interchangeably, but this article will stick to the strict definitions based on the age of the victim. Neonaticide. Neonaticide is the murder of a child on the day they are born or within the first 24 hours of their life. Let's talk about common characteristics of neonaticide. it is almost always committed by mothers. Children are at the greatest risk of murder on the first day of life. Fun fact, or not so fun fact. Women who commit filicide are typically immature, younger than 25 years old, and unmarried. They are unemployed or have limited socioeconomic means and are usually no longer involved with the child's father. They are often still living with their parents or still going to school. They describe their fathers as being overbearing or abusive and their mothers as absent. The majority were raised in homes with emotional neglect, role confusion, and violations of boundaries. This is often their first pregnancy, and it's usually unintentional. They have no desire to become a parent at the time. They deny and or conceal their pregnancies and are afraid of discovery. They fear the disclosure of the pregnancy will lead to rejection by their family and friends. Typically, they have little or no support system when they become pregnant. They may also assume the child is stillborn. The women usually conceal the pregnancy and give birth alone and at home, although there are recorded cases where the woman had the child in a birthing unit. They make the decision not to make any changes in their lives, such as seeking prenatal care, and do not form any maternal attachments to the child. They often have no plans for the child's care. Majority of neonaticidal women are not mentally ill at the time of the murder and appear to be lucid and purposeful in their behavior. They have this unwanted child, and so they kill them, thereby eliminating the problem. Neonaticide is difficult to track and easy to get away with because the evidence is easier to conceal. Day-old babies are tiny and easy to dispose of. Those who do not directly kill the child often dump or abandon the infant, hoping they will die. Infanticide. The highest likelihood of filicide in general occurs in the first year of a child's life, with the greatest risk being on the first day. After that, the highest risk is within the first year of life. One study in England, Scotland, and Wales found that infants less than 1 year old were 4 times more likely to be murdered than any other age group. The only children with higher risk are babies less than a day old. The first day of life bears the highest risk of filicidal murder. Characteristics of infanticide. It's almost exclusively committed by mothers. One study has it that in 73% of the cases, infanticides are committed by mothers. The predominance of women in infanticide cases is likely because of women's role as primary caretakers at this stage. Men's likelihood of filicide increases later in childhood, and that of women decreases. The women are usually older, often married, and well educated. These are the women who commit infanticide. Mental illness or psychosis may be a factor in their murder of the infant. Majority of the women had altruistic motives as well as depression or psychotic illnesses. I'll provide a few cases as we go on, and so here's one. An example includes 23-year-old Kiera Tolson, who starved her 14-month-old daughter for about 3.5 weeks before placing the corpse in a dumpster. Filicide. Filicide refers to the murder of a child who is more than a year old by their parents. It can also include murder by a parental figure such as a guardian or step-parent. More often than not, filicide occurs in the home because that's where majority of childcare happens. Filicide is divided into several categories based on the perceived motive of the perpetrator or the source of their homicidal act. There is considerable overlap in the classifications in actual practice, so look out for that. Altruistic filicide. In this case, the parent kills the child because they perceive it to be in the child's best interest in order to relieve some type of real or imagined suffering. For example, a woman may kill her terminally ill child to alleviate their pain and suffering. The murder may or may not be linked to psychotic issues. Overall, the crime in this instance is believed to have been committed out of love and not hate or anger or malice. One criticism of this category is that it is almost always attributed to women. According to critics, it's anchored on the myth that women are always loving mothers even when they murder their offspring. This category often overlaps with psychotic filicide, especially when the woman has paranoid delusions. Case study on altruistic filicide. For instance, in 2011, Julie Schenker shot her 13-year-old son as they were driving home from soccer practice. When she arrived at home, she shot her 16-year-old daughter. During trial, it was revealed that she had planned to kill the children and reportedly had no regrets because she had, quote, saved them from abuse. She explained being raped as a child had ruined her life and she could not let the same thing happen to her children. Acutely psychotic filicide. This is where the perpetrator is suffering from a major psychiatric disorder at the time they committed the offense. A major characteristic of this category is the absence of any rational motive or benefit to the perpetrator. They're not doing it for revenge or for any kind of secondary gain. I'll share a few case studies on this ahead. Unwanted child filicide. Neonaticides, which is the murder of children within the first 24 hours of life, all fall in this category. Unwanted child filicide refers to the murder of a child who was never wanted or is no longer wanted. It also includes the murder of illegitimate children or those conceived from extramarital affairs. The most common reason associated with filicide in general is unwanted pregnancies and undesired children. Case study 1. Becky Sue Marrow concealed her pregnancy for 9 months, then dismembered and burned her newborn son. According to her lawyers, she was in a dissociated mental state at the time of the crime. However, as Marrow had tried to hide a pregnancy in the past, had attempted to divert witnesses from the pit where she burned the infant's corpse, and did not suffer from any symptoms of amnesia, it is likely that the psychiatrist was correct when he told the court she had clear insight, she knew exactly what she was doing. Another case, Romina Tejerina and Stephanie Collins never met and yet share a kind of frightening sisterhood. They both murdered their newborn babies immediately after giving birth. Tejerina, a 23-year-old Argentine, became pregnant as the result of a sexual assault and was afraid to tell anyone. Within minutes of giving birth to a daughter at home, Tejerina stabbed the baby repeatedly, who died 2 days later. Collins, a 27-year-old American, had previously had an abortion and lived in a state with a newborn safe haven program. Collins concealed her pregnancy, gave birth out of the hospital, then immediately killed the newborn son and put his body in the garbage. In Connecticut, the Safe Haven program allows a parent to voluntarily give up a newborn who is 30 days old or younger at a hospital or emergency room without any risk of prosecution for abandonment. These types of programs were supposed to reduce the murder of unwanted infants. Accidental filicide. This is where the parent murders the child after prolonged neglect or severe child abuse or maltreatment. It's called accidental because the parent does not intend to kill the child. For example, a parent can violently harm a baby who is persistently crying. These homicides are often linked to battered child syndrome. Case studies ahead. Spousal revenge filicide. In this instance, the perpetrator kills the child in retaliation against the other parent or spouse because of some perceived wrongdoing. The murder is premeditated and executed in order to cause suffering to their spouse or to punish them. Case studies ahead on this one too. Gender and filicide. We've talked about the categories broadly. Let's take a deeper dive. Most research has focused and continues to focus on mothers so that female perpetrators are disproportionately represented in the research and in media stories, leading to the misconception that it is an exclusively female crime when it's not. It is one of the few crimes that women commit as much as or almost as much as men. There continues to be very limited research on paternal filicide. Statistics. Research finds that paternal filicide is just as common, or in some instances more common, than maternal filicide. Women are more likely than men to commit neonaticide and infanticide, but after that first year of life, fathers and stepfathers become the most frequent perpetrators of filicide. The most common categories for paternal filicide are accidental filicide and retaliating filicide. Fathers are not just the most frequent perpetrators of killing after the first year of life, they are also most likely to kill or attempt to kill the entire family, which is referred to as familicide. Familicides are predominantly committed by men, genetic fathers, and are motivated by marital trouble and financial issues. Most countries don't track or keep updated statistics on filicide. Many instances of infant child deaths go unreported. It's also a crime that's relatively easy to get away with, especially for the mothers who conceal their pregnancies. Infants are small enough to dispose of or get rid of their bodies. Infant deaths are also likely to be falsely or mistakenly attributed to sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS. One study found that 64% of the corpses of newborns were discovered accidentally in garbage cans and other refuse disposal sites. None of those newborns could be matched to a missing persons report, which meant they had been intentionally abandoned or disposed of. Inaccurate coroner rulings have a significant impact on the recorded rates of child murder. Victims. Some studies report that there is a higher incidence of male offspring being victims compared to female offspring. Other papers find that there isn't any significant variation between male and female victims. For this reason, it has been put forward that the reason there is a higher infanticide rate where male infants are concerned may be because statistically more males are born. It's also been suggested that particularly when it comes to accidental filicide, which is linked to prolonged abuse, male infants may be more at risk because of the perception that they are more aggressive and therefore require harsher discipline. Victims are at the highest risk of being murdered on their first day of life. After the first week, there's a slight decline, but the risk remains high until about the 6th month. The risk steadily drops after the first year and is at its lowest point when they are 10 years old. Domestic violence. Domestic violence is defined as a pattern of abusive behavior in which a person uses coercion, deception, harassment, humiliation, manipulation, or force to establish control over an intimate partner. The perpetrator uses a variety of tactics to sustain their control over and achieve the submission of their partners. The tactics may be economic, emotional, psychological, physical, sexual, or verbal. There's a strong link between paternal filicides and domestic violence, a correlation strong enough for domestic violence to be considered a precursor to filicide. This is important to take into account, especially considering many women report that abuse either begins when the woman gets pregnant or intensifies when they get pregnant. Child abuse and maltreatment often co-occurs with wife assault. One study found that filicidal fathers were violent to family members and paternal perpetrators often attempt to kill their wives. Another study reports that in 18% of the cases, child murder occurred in conjunction with uxoricide, which is wife murder. A history of aggressive behavior was found in about 27% of a sample of filicidal fathers. There's also a link between maternal filicides and intimate partner violence. One study of infanticidal mothers found that all the women in the sample were victims of violence by their partners. Another found that 50% of infanticidal mothers were living in violent relationships. One study out of Italy found that 46% of filicidal mothers were experiencing intimate partner violence. In another general filicide study, domestic violence towards the mother was reported in 79% of the cases. These women murdered their children to save them from a world they perceived as and knew to be violent. This is an example of an overlap between altruistic and pathological motivations. One of the most interesting things about paternal filicide is it occurs even when the father is not a part of the child's life. In about 30% of the cases, the child was separated from the perpetrator soon after birth. These children died largely as a result of battering. Another interesting thing about the way we respond to filicidal women in abusive relationships is the system blames and re-victimizes them. Women in abusive relationships who have children often stay for many reasons, including fear of their partner and their financial dependence on him. They may fail to disclose their abuse because of trauma and shame. They then have to deal with criticism from everyone about failing to protect their children from an abusive man who ends up killing their child. Even in instances when it is the woman who has committed filicide, disclosing intimate partner violence still leads to her being perceived as an irresponsible mother who failed to protect her child. Whether they are perpetrators or not, women always get blamed. Methods. Genetic parents are more likely to use methods perceived as quick and relatively painless as compared to step-parents, though men are still more likely to use violent methods. In the case of maternal filicide, drowning and suffocation were the most commonly used methods. Neonaticide was most often committed by suffocation. Other commonly used methods include carbon monoxide poisoning, strangulation, and stabbing. In paternal filicide, the most commonly used methods are firearms and battery. One study also found head injuries as the most frequent cause of death when paternal filicide occurs. It's unusual for women to beat children to death. In areas where access to firearms is limited, filicidal fathers tended to use more active methods like striking, squeezing, and stabbing. A study out of Canada found that the most common method of homicide for filicidal fathers was stabbing. Step-parents. Step-parents often choose more violent methods, including beating and bludgeoning. The presence of a stepmother's genetic offspring increased the risk of abuse and violence, though stepmothers have the lowest likelihood of killing children. One study found that of all the step-parental homicides, 92% of them were committed by men. The most likely victims of stepfathers are stepsons, who have the highest likelihood of being killed, and then stepdaughters. Stepmothers have the least likely instance of killing their stepchildren. Socioeconomic factors. Historical reasons for filicide persist in some instances. One of the main reasons for filicide in the past was population control socially and within the family. It was often an economic consideration based on the resources at hand. One paper reported that almost all maternal perpetrators of filicide exhibited high levels of stress and lack of support and resources at the time of the murder. Another study found that they are often from low socioeconomic backgrounds, they're socially isolated, and they're full-time caregivers. One study found that if you control for other factors, women who drop out of school are 8 times more likely to murder their infants than women who had college education. The level of education here is a major contributor to socioeconomic status. Suicide. Fathers are more likely to commit suicide after filicide. Parents who kill older children, in general, are also at an increased risk of committing suicide. Mothers who murder older children or multiple victims had an increased risk of suicide, and it was associated with extreme psychiatric disturbances. Altruistic filicide. One study found that maternal filicide was most frequently done for altruistic reasons. Acutely psychotic filicide. Mental disorders have been found to play a role in both maternal and paternal filicides. However, they are more pronounced in female perpetrators than in male perpetrators. The most common ailments are depression and psychosis, which are more common in mothers than in fathers. Mothers are more likely than fathers to display active symptoms of a mental disorder at the time of the offense. Recent studies report that 85% of mothers and 56% of fathers had a diagnosis of major depressive disorder, schizophrenia, or other psychosis. More women were likely to suffer from psychosis than men, with maternal filicide often presented as the result of psychopathology. One study found that filicidal mothers were severely depressed and had a history of previous suicide attempts. Other research finds that the presence of serious mental illness is one of the main factors leading to maternal filicide. In this way, maternal filicide may be a direct consequence of untreated mental illness. Some studies have found that most women convicted of killing their child claim to have suffered physical or sexual abuse as children. Women in abusive relationships are more likely to develop symptoms consistent with postpartum depression. Postpartum depression, PPD, increases the likelihood of harming an infant. The highest risk of maternal mental illness is within 3 months of childbirth. 1 in 7 women will experience postpartum depression, and the postpartum year carries the highest risk of developing mental illness in a woman's life. Psychosis in postpartum women occurs in an estimated 1 in 1,000 births. Postpartum psychosis starts within a day or 2 of birth to 2 months after the child is born. The symptoms include hallucination, delusions, delirium, and confusion. Poor women and women experiencing intimate partner violence are more likely to suffer from postpartum depression. In the US, the population with the highest rates of comorbid or simultaneous intimate partner violence and postpartum depression are Black teenage moms. Case study: acutely psychotic filicide. Case 1. In 2004, 35-year-old Texan Dana Schlosser had voices commanding her to remove the arms of her 11-month-old daughter as a sacrifice to God, and she obeyed the voices. This was not Schlosser's first psychotic episode. She had another psychotic episode after the birth of her middle child, which resulted in both a hospitalization and an investigation by Child Protective Services. However, the case was closed after 7 months, and Child Protective Services concluded that Schlosser was not a threat to her children. After the death of her daughter, Schlosser was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, found not guilty by reason of insanity, and sent to the North Texas State Hospital. She was later released by court order to outpatient care. The judge, perhaps mindful of the infamous Yates case, mandated that Schlosser not only attend weekly psychiatric treatment, but also comply with compulsory medication and birth control. Case 2. The following is a case study example of a 30-year-old Mexican-American woman treated at Patton State Hospital. She reportedly experienced significant emotional loss as a child. Her biological mother was young and was unable to parent her child due to her own emotional difficulties. Consequently, the patient was adopted by family members and became the youngest of 8 children. The patient was reportedly stigmatized as a result of being the only adopted child and having a mother who suffered with mental illness. At 10 years old, her adoptive mother separated her from the rest of her family when they moved to California, to an area in which substance abuse, poverty, and low education were common. At 12 years old, she was molested by a male family member. Shortly after the abuse, she began struggling with substance abuse, including alcohol, cannabis, cocaine, and methamphetamines. Noteworthy, her mother contributed to her substance use by supplying her with drugs at times. Throughout her teenage years, she experienced multiple pregnancies and abortions, demonstrated aggressive behavior, that is fighting, and stopped attending school. At 16 years old, she gave birth to a son and struggled with her addiction while trying to raise him. When her son was 2 years old, he returned to her house from a visit with his father and appeared inconsolable as he reportedly would not stop crying, refused to eat, and hid from his mother. She reportedly believed he had been abused by his father, and while under the influence of cocaine, she became increasingly paranoid, resulting in the delusional belief that her ex-boyfriend was the devil and would turn their son into the devil as well. On Christmas Eve, as a means of attempting to protect her son, she smothered him to death with the intention of saving him by giving him to Jesus as a gift for his birthday. Following the realization of what she had done, she turned herself in and was committed to the state psychiatric hospital. Accidental filicide. This is often most perpetrated by fathers and is usually the result of ongoing abuse, maltreatment, or neglect. There's no link to mental illness or a psychotic disorder, but there's a correlation to family violence. The most common reason it happens is attempting to control a child's behavior or misinterpretation of a child's behavior and responding violently. The perpetrators are more likely to have a history of violence or maltreatment towards the child, as in it's not a sudden, one-time thing. Paternal filicide is often the result of fatal abuse and excessive use of corporal punishment to discipline a child. Case study: accidental filicide. Case 1. This filicide was the fatal outcome of protracted abuse and neglect. The defendant had come to question the paternity of his 4-year-old daughter because he felt that she bore no physical resemblance to him or any of his other children. The defendant grew to resent the 4-year-old, who became the target of his hostility and rage. At the time of the incident, the defendant, a 32-year-old laborer, was living in a major urban locale with his wife and 4 children. Sharing the household were the defendant's father, brother, and sisters. The child's presumed lack of physical resemblance fueled the father's charges of wifely infidelity and that the 4-year-old was the product of this illicit relationship, charges the wife repeatedly denied. Most of the rage and resentment was directed towards the 4-year-old girl, to whom he meted out extremely cruel treatment, including regular beatings and other atrocities. These included forbidding her to eat with other family members, serving her bones and scraps of food on a dog dish, denying her food at times, tying her to a tree beside the house for several hours at a time under the pouring rain or the scorching sun, and being forced to sleep on the bare floor. Poor nutrition, coupled with constant physical and psychological abuse, left the child emaciated and fragile. While extended family members and neighbors were aware of the father's abusive behavior, no one ever intervened or contacted the authorities. In the final assault on his daughter, the defendant threw a scrubbing brush at her, causing a bleeding head wound. The defendant delayed taking the 4-year-old to the hospital. When the victim was finally transported to the hospital, she died on the way. A post-mortem examination revealed that the actual cause of death was anemia and malnutrition. The assault with the scrubbing brush was believed to have precipitated a seizure or other physiological reactions secondary to complications brought on by poor health and a weakened physical condition. The defendant was convicted of the crime and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. Case 2. According to court records, the defendant, a 23-year-old man, was employed as a casual laborer. At the time of the incident, he and his wife had been married for roughly 2 years. The father had allegedly been despondent about his recent loss of employment. On the day of the incident, the mother left the infant in the care of the defendant while she went to launder clothes in a nearby stream. She left a feeding bottle with the defendant with instructions to feed the baby if she cried. When the mother returned 2 hours later, she found the infant lying under a table in the living room, limp and not breathing. The mother rushed the baby to the hospital, but the infant was pronounced dead on arrival. The defendant initially told hospital authorities that he had accidentally dropped the baby. However, he later admitted that he had throttled the baby when he could not get her to cease crying. A post-mortem examination revealed that the infant had died from strangulation. The defendant was charged with murder of his infant daughter. A psychiatric evaluation revealed that the defendant was mentally unstable but capable of making a plea to the charge. The defendant pleaded not guilty. In the ensuing trial, 2 of the 3 assessors found the defendant not guilty by reason of his mental state, while 1 found him guilty of the offense. The judge accepted the majority verdict and ordered the defendant to be placed in the St. Giles Mental Hospital. Case 3. Known in Fiji's judicial circles as the banana murder case, this child homicide illustrates the draconian lengths to which some parents actually go to discipline their children, taking the injunction to spare the rod, spoil the child to a literal and fatal conclusion. In this case, a father brutally assaulted his 8-year-old son after the boy allegedly took a banana without his permission from a bunch sitting on the family dining table. The father punished the child by kicking him down a flight of stairs and beating him into unconsciousness with a belt and a stick. He barred his wife and other members of the household from seeking medical treatment for the victim. The youngster died 2 days later. The father was charged with his murder. During the ensuing criminal trial, the father testified that his son had committed the abhorrent sin. During the ensuing criminal trial, the father testified that his son had committed the abhorrent sin of stealing and that it was his parental responsibility to discipline him. The defendant was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Case 4. On the night of the homicide, the perpetrator, a 27-year-old farmer, returned home heavily intoxicated. After dinner, he started an altercation with his wife and physically assaulted her. Upon hearing their mother's cries for help, the couple's 4 children became distressed. After repeatedly commanding the children to cease crying, the enraged father picked up his 2-year-old son and hurled him across the room, slamming his head against the doorpost. The mother rushed and picked up the child, who had started bleeding from the nose. Before leaving for the hospital, the father instructed his wife to tell medical personnel that the child fell from a cliff. The child was pronounced dead on arrival for injuries sustained to the head. Personnel at the health center accepted the mother's version of events and no foul play was suspected. A postmortem examination indicated that he had died from brain hemorrhage. Roughly a month after the boy's death, the defendant assaulted his wife again. This time the mother called the police. When being questioned by police over this assault, she told the authorities what actually happened to her son. The defendant confessed to the police, admitting concealing the crime to protect himself from criminal prosecution. He was arrested and charged with murder, but the charges were later amended to manslaughter. The defendant was convicted and sentenced to 6 years imprisonment. Spousal revenge filicide. Revenge and retaliation are one of the most common reasons for paternal filicide. One study found that filicidal fathers are mostly motivated by marital problems or marital discord. They found that the men were motivated by jealousy, anger, impulsivity, and revenge. Risk factors in such cases include marital disharmony or separation and sexual jealousy. One study found that a quarter of filicidal fathers were motivated by the desire to retaliate against their partner. Retaliating maternal filicide is rare. Mothers who do it often have personality disorders and high incidences of suicide attempts. Revenge filicide often goes hand in hand with familicide. Familicide is when the perpetrator kills not just the child but the entire family, including his wife. Familicide is almost exclusively done by men. Case studies. Case 1. This is the worst case of multicide or mass murder on record in Fiji. A sugarcane farmer brutally bludgeoned his wife and their 5 children in response to suspicions that his wife was engaged in an illicit affair with a neighbor. On the day of the murders, he reportedly told his wife that he would be attending a wedding ceremony in an adjacent village. Instead, he hid in the bushes next to their home to see if his suspicions would be confirmed. He alleged that an hour later, a man entered his house to consort with his wife. Consumed with rage, he grabbed a machete and butchered his wife and all 5 of his children. According to his statement to the police, his wife's paramour fled the house before he could assault him. The defendant was convicted of the crimes and sentenced to 6 life sentences. Case study 2. A 29-year-old father doused his house with kerosene and set it ablaze while his 4 children, his wife, and brother-in-law remained asleep inside. The farm laborer was allegedly incensed by his wife's refusal to act upon a request. The defendant's wife had prepared her family a chicken dinner earlier in the day while her husband and brother-in-law drank liquor nearby. After the children finished their dinner, they were put to bed. Shortly thereafter, the woman retired to bed, leaving the 2 men to their drinking. About 2 hours later, after his brother-in-law had also retired to bed, the inebriated father woke up his wife to serve him his dinner. She refused, asking him to warm up his own dinner. The defendant prepared his own dinner, enraged by his wife's response. After completing his meal, He walked to the section of the house where he kept a drum of kerosene and poured some of the chemical around the inside of the house and lit a match, setting the house ablaze. His wife and brother-in-law managed to escape with moderate burns, but were unable to rescue their 4 sleeping children from the burning flames. Following the murders, the man walked to the local police station to turn himself in. He attempted suicide while in police custody, claiming he was led to this action by police assault on him. No attorney was willing to represent the defendant in a criminal trial, forcing him to represent himself. In his defense, he argued that his homicidal actions were not premeditated, but that he was drunk and lost control when his wife insulted him. He was subsequently convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment for the crime. Legal. Let's talk about some of the legal aspects of filicide briefly, very, very briefly. Historically, the death penalty was supposed to be the default sentence. However, judges and juries were reluctant to condemn women who killed their children. This was a major surprise for me. Real interesting too. The assumption was that women were mentally disturbed after childbirth and could not be said to be in full control of their actions. For this reason, infanticide is perceived and legally treated as less of a serious criminal offense than murder. As a result, courts consistently give women shorter sentences than men convicted of the same crime. Interesting. Prevention. Some of the key factors linked to filicide are poverty and financial difficulties, social isolation, single motherhood, work-related stress, housing problems, the mother's own upbringing including childhood abuse and trauma, marital problems and abuse, physical illness, mental illness, and psychotic symptoms. These are the things we need to be thinking about as we consider ways to reduce and even fully eliminate filicide. I think particularly when it comes to neonaticide and infanticide, we can work towards 0 murders. Abortion, birth control, and sex education. The most frequent reason for filicide is an unwanted pregnancy or undesired child. One key response is minimizing the number of unwanted pregnancies. Sexual and reproductive health education needs to be widespread and devoid of shame and judgment. Contraception needs to be available and accessible to all populations, particularly poor young girls and women. This contraception should also include safe, accessible abortion. Contraception has been shown to reduce filicide. In Senegal, one study found that infanticide was linked first to the inaccessibility of abortion, which is criminalized, and second to societal conditions that make childbearing unacceptable. Some of the conditions that make childbearing unacceptable include having a child out of wedlock whose father has denied paternity, or having a child who is the product of infidelity or rape. All of these conditions bear the risk of societal or familial ostracization and the resultant fear that comes with that. The case of South Africa is interesting because they have liberal abortion laws and accessible contraception services, and yet they still have high incidences of unwanted pregnancies. One study in South Africa found that men play a role in jointly deciding to abandon a newborn. That was interesting to me. I always assumed women make these decisions alone. Another factor influencing filicide in the study was men's denial of paternity. Economic and social support. Mothers' likelihood of committing filicide positively correlates with economic stress and unemployment, as well as limited education and social isolation. One study found that there was a disproportionate number of women of low socioeconomic status among women who committed filicide. Financial stresses are also reported in some patricide cases. A study of filicidal fathers found that they often have a history of drug abuse and are mostly unskilled or semi-skilled workers in low-wage occupations. Social support needs to be provided to struggling or distressed parents. In Finland, the government has public health services with psychiatric units where children under 3 and their parents can go. The facilities support early interactions and offer interventions for families in distress. Some American states have safe haven laws that allow a mother to leave her child safely anonymously at designated sites such as hospitals without the risk of prosecution. These laws were introduced to discourage infanticide, but evidence of efficacy is still lacking. Perhaps more research needs to be done. One of the key factors in maternal filicide is mental illness. One study found that poverty and a lack of social support increase the risk of serious mental health problems. At the risk of sounding like a communist, give mothers money and fund social services that support young mothers and families. Let women be assured of a measure of support as they raise the next generation. Research confirms that lack of resources is a key reason for maternal filicide. Psychiatric support. Both maternal and paternal filicide are linked to mental illness, with maternal filicide most often presented as a result of psychopathology. There's evidence of a strong connection between maternal filicide and psychiatric disorders. Clinicians need to be trained to recognize risk factors including psychiatric history and signs of distress such as depression, lack of sleep, and other socioeconomic stress. Patients with a prior history of mental illness, including suicide attempts and self-harm, need to be assessed and closely monitored. There needs to be open communication channels between healthcare professionals to coordinate patient care. Women should also be regularly screened for postpartum depression. Mental health services should be accessible to all women, especially poor women and girls. Domestic violence. Domestic violence is so closely correlated with paternal filicide as to be considered a precursor. The correlation between domestic violence and maternal filicide is slightly more complicated. All health and social workers who come into contact with women need to collaborate and screen for intimate partner violence. This is especially critical for pregnant women because IPV begins during pregnancy or escalates at that time. They need to be able to assess the women and caretakers to determine the potential level of harm to the child. Domestic violence increases the child's risk of harm from both the mother and father. Screening for it and responding appropriately is critical when we're talking about child safety. Limitations. A disproportionate amount of the research has focused on and continues to focus on maternal filicide, with limited research, if any, on paternal filicide. This has led to the misconception that this is a crime primarily perpetrated by women, when men's likelihood of filicide is higher than that of women after the first year. Most of the studies also use small sample sizes. This kind of data is not always available for a variety of reasons, including most governments are not actively collecting it. Large samples are needed in order to make accurate generalizations. And finally, most of the research is from developed, industrialized nations, with societies in the developing world virtually ignored or excluded altogether. In conclusion, if we claim to care about children at all, then we need to address the conditions that lead to their abuse and murder. Economic and social support are critical, especially for women. We need sexual health education and widespread, judgment-free access to contraceptives, including abortion. We need to address the gender inequalities that continue to fuel the kind of interpersonal abuse that sometimes leads to the death of children and even the woman. Gender inequality is an existential threat to women and children. Pole sana, I'm so sorry to all the children who've been killed, sometimes in horrific ways, sometimes after extended abuse and suffering. All that suffering being borne by people who were days old, months old, just a few years old, is heartbreaking. Rest in peace, babies. Hopefully, we're able to protect other children. Rest in peace. Just thank you for stopping by. Until next time, remember who you are. Love life, love people, and stay lunatic. Bye.